I woke up to the eerie stillness of the morning. There was no soft sound of waves lapping at the shore, no faint hum of the pool pump, no shimmering reflections dancing on the walls. Just silence. Dazed and confused, I stumbled out of bed, slipped into my slippers, and hurried outside. What I saw made my mind spin. I couldn't believe my eyes. My massive, perfectly maintained pool, the pride of my backyard, was completely dry. Not a single drop of water. What had once been a sparkling oasis now resembled a vast, empty pit in the middle of my yard. Then I noticed them. A small group of neighborhood board members stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed, wearing expressions of quiet satisfaction. At the forefront was Margaret Wilkins, the self-appointed enforcer of all things neighborhood protocol. She had a clipboard in hand and an annoyingly smug grin plastered on her face. "Good morning, Jason," she called out, her tone sickeningly sweet. "I see you've noticed our little improvement." I blinked, struggling to process what was happening. Improvement, I repeated, staring at the empty pool. What happened to my pool? Margaret sighed dramatically, as if I were the unreasonable one. "The neighborhood association voted to have it drained," she said with exaggerated patience. "We sent you a notice a couple of weeks ago." She pointed toward my mailbox, where a bright orange envelope stuck out like a sore thumb. I ripped it open and scanned the letter. Violation hashtag 472C, unauthorized water use. Effective immediately. Fine, $3,000. I let out a dry laugh, reading the letter again to see if it would somehow make sense. "You actually drained my pool?" I asked, unable to believe what I was hearing. Margaret smiled smugly. "It's not about permission, Jason. It's about being responsible. We're in a drought." I stared at her, confused. "Drought? The city hasn't declared one." Margaret sniffed. "The association has. We need to set an example." I glanced over her shoulder toward the perfectly green community golf course just down the street. Its sprinklers were still running, spraying water into the air like it was nothing. "What about that?" I asked, throwing my hands up. "Or the ridiculous fountain by the clubhouse? Or the fact that I pay for my own water?" Margaret let out a fake, high-pitched laugh. "Oh, Jason, homeowners often don't understand what's best for the neighborhood. That's why the board is here to make those tough decisions for you." I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to scream. "So, you drained my pool because of this drought, even though I pay for the water myself, in a neighborhood where people waste more water on plants than a small town uses in a week." "That's correct," she said with a slight nod. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to suppress the anger that was rising. "And what if I refuse to pay this fine?" Her eyes lit up with satisfaction. "Then we'll put a lien on your property." I clenched my teeth, fighting back a retort. This was exactly the kind of absurd overreach I'd heard about in horror stories. But this was something else. Draining my pool was not just an inconvenience. It was a blatant power move. I took a step forward, locking eyes with Margaret. "You know, Margaret," I said, my voice low and calm, "I don't think you realize who you're dealing with." Margaret scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "Oh, please, don't start with that. Rules are rules." I chuckled, but it wasn't a friendly sound. It was the kind of laugh that meant I knew something she didn't. "Margaret," I said, leaning in a little closer, "do you know where the water for this neighborhood comes from?" Her confident expression faltered slightly. "The city, obviously." I smiled, and it wasn't a warm one. "Wrong." Her frown deepened. "What?" I crossed my arms, letting the tension build. 20 years ago, when this neighborhood was being developed, the original landowners didn't sell the water rights to the city. They sold them to a private investor. Margaret's brows furrowed. "What's that got to do with anything?" I tilted my head slightly. "That investor was me." The silence was thick, almost suffocating. Margaret blinked a few times and then burst out laughing, but it was an awkward, strained laugh. "That's impossible." I shrugged. "Is it?" For the first time, Margaret looked unsure. I could see it in the way her shoulders stiffened and her jaw tightened. She didn't know. Of course she didn't. The board members never read the fine print of their contracts. "Tell me, Margaret," I said, my voice turning colder. "You know that water-saving fee you're about to impose on everyone? It'd be a real shame if there wasn't any water left to conserve." Her face went pale. I leaned in a little closer, speaking in a near whisper. You just picked a fight with someone who controls every drop of water in this neighborhood. Margaret took a step back, but her facade of control was quickly crumbling. You can't just turn off the water, she stammered. I smiled again. Can I? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I patted her shoulder in mock sympathy. You really should have read the contract. And with that, I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving her standing there, flustered and powerless. The next morning, I sat on my porch with a steaming cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood slowly come alive. Birds chirped, joggers passed by, and the sprinklers on the HOA golf course kicked on in a synchronized pattern. It was a serene, peaceful moment, perfect in every way, right before it all started to change. I finished my coffee, pulled out my phone, and made a call. It took less than 5 minutes for chaos to erupt. At first, the sprinklers sputtered and slowed. People didn't think much of it. Maybe a minor plumbing issue. But soon it got worse. Hoses that had been left on were now running at a trickle. A woman watering her garden stood in disbelief as only air hissed out of her nozzle. Then came the shouting. Margaret had no idea what was happening. I watched her storm out of her house in her bathrobe. Phone pressed to her ear, rushing toward the HOA office. Other board members followed, equally confused. From my porch, I saw the look on Margaret's face transform from smug to pure frustration. Then the real panic set in. Neighbors knocked on doors, asking about the water shortage. A man in gym clothes swore loudly when he turned on his kitchen faucet to find it dry. A woman stared at her half-filled bathtub, like it was her last reservoir of water. And then, oh, the best part. The HOA's prize golf course sprinklers shut off mid-cycle, leaving the once green lawn parched and vulnerable under the hot sun. The decorative fountain by the community center sputtered once, then stopped completely. Margaret was yelling, barking orders at her fellow board members, but they looked utterly helpless. She was waving her phone around as if she could somehow command the water to return. I knew exactly what she was doing, calling the city. She was in for surprise. I stretched and stood, walking casually toward the HOA office, pretending to be just another confused homeowner. The crowd outside was growing, with people demanding answers from Margaret, who looked ready to lose it. Everyone, please remain calm, she said, though her voice was shaking. We're working on fixing the issue and will restore the water as soon as possible. A few homeowners were skeptical, crossing their arms. One woman in a bathrobe raised an eyebrow. I thought the HOA was all about water conservation, she said. Margaret's eye twitched, but she forced a smile. Yes, and conservation is important, but this is just an unexpected infrastructure failure. As the sun rose higher, the full scope of Margaret's mistake began to set in. The neighborhood, once united under the banner of HOA rules and regulations, was now a powder keg ready to explode. The residents, once complacent under the thumb of her authority, were beginning to ask questions she had no answers to. Margaret's grip on the situation, like the water supply she'd so callously cut off, was slipping. She had underestimated me, thinking she could bend the rules to her will without any consequences. But I wasn't the type to be intimidated by petty power plays. The ripple effect of my actions was already visible. The HOA members were scrambling to fix what they'd broken, but their credibility had been shattered. I made it clear that sometimes the people who hold the real power aren't the ones with the loudest voices or the biggest titles. I controlled the flow, both literally and figuratively. As I watched Margaret's futile attempts to restore order, I couldn't help but smile. She would soon realize what it meant to challenge someone who wasn't afraid to take a stand. And as for the rest of the neighborhood, they were about to learn a powerful lesson in standing up to the status quo, one drop at a time. As the chaos unfolded, I knew this was only the beginning. Margaret's days of unquestioned authority were numbered. The neighborhood would never be the same, and neither would she.